Good day. I hope you're doing well. Today we're here to talk about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. To introduce you to the spinal cord, I just wanted to point out three functions of the spinal cord. One is that it mediates reflexes by taking in sensory information and quickly pushing out motor impulses or motor signals to trigger effectors to create a rapid response. We won't be talking much about reflexes, but wanted to mention that just in case you're curious. Second, the important role of the spinal cord is to help relay sensory information, to take sensory information from the peripheral nervous system and deliver it to the central nervous system. The important function is that it is linking the spinal nerves to the brain. So that would be from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, especially in regards to the brain. And finally, in the central nervous system, whether it's the brain or the spinal cord, there has to be motor output that is taken to effectors. So this would include something like where sensory information is gathered, such as the form of, say, a fly landing on your hand. That sensory information has to go to the spinal cord, where it could be processed by interneurons there, or it could also be processed by interneurons in the brain. Based upon that sensation, it would then cause the interneurons to mount a response. This would then occur through motor output to effectors, which could also be carried through the spinal cord to reach distant muscles. So we're going to talk about the spinal cord first, starting with protective structures of the spinal cord. There are several different types of tissues that protect the spinal cord to prevent it from being damaged. The first type is bone. The second are various types of connective tissues. And the third is the fluid type protection and nourishment that is provided to the spinal cord. So first, let's talk about the location of the spinal cord. Most importantly, you should know that the spinal cord is located inside the vertebral column. This is the stack of several dozen vertebrae that go up and down and form the spine. Now, if you take one vertebra, such as on the left, you can see that there is a hole in the middle of it called the vertebral foramen. This is the hole that allows for the vertebra to surround the spinal cord completely. When the different vertebrae are stacked on top of each other, they form the vertebral column, and through it is the long pathway that the spinal cord can sit inside of. In addition to the bone tissue, which is formed by each vertebra, we also have connective tissue layers that protect the spinal cord. The name of these spinal cord connective tissue membranes are meninges or spinal meninges. These have the same names as the cranial meninges. Starting from the deepest of the spinal cord meninges, we have the pia mater. Superficial to the pia mater is the arachnoid mater. Superficial to that is the final connective tissue of the meninges, which is the dura mater. Now, the dura mater is also continuous with the spinal nerves coverings. So this dense irregular connective tissue continues out. There are also modifications of the spinal meninges, such as in the form of something called denticulate ligaments. Denticulate ligaments sounds like the word dental or teeth. What denticulate ligaments describe are little tooth-like extensions. In this picture, they kind of look like shark's teeth that attach from the spinal cord, which is traveling down the middle, The pia mater extends to grab onto the dura mater. This serves as an anchor to keep the spinal cord attached to the dura mater so that it doesn't move too much during movement. So we have denticulate ligaments as a specialization of the pia mater, where little extensions connect to the dura mater to hold the spinal cord in place. Now, there's actually more connective tissue that we can see that protects the spinal cord, but we need to change our view to instead look at a cross section or a transverse section. So let's take a look at that, where we're going to take a section through the spinal cord and the vertebra to be able to see some more layers. In the very middle of this picture, the tan, dark brown circle is the spinal cord at the very center. It's within the vertebral foramen. Coming out of the sides of the vertebra are spinal nerves. You can see on the anterior the large heart-shaped vertebral body. So let's take a look at a zoomed-in picture of the spinal cord to see the structures, once again, that protect it and find one more layer. So starting at the outside of the spinal cord, we have the bone that surrounds the spinal cord, which is known as a vertebra. Then deep to the vertebra is a space which is outside of the dura mater. We call that the epidural space, and it is filled with adipose tissue, which we call epidural fat. This is another type of connective tissue that helps to cushion the spinal cord, this epidural fat, which is adipose connective tissue. Now, deep to the epidural space has to be the dura mater, and the dura mater surrounds the spinal cord and also continues on to the outside of the spinal nerves. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, which is made up of collagen and elastin fibers. And then deep to the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space. This is the location where we find cerebrospinal fluid circulating around the spinal cord. Finally, deep to the subarachnoid space, we have the pia mater, which lies directly against the spinal cord. So from this view, you can see that there are several different bones, connective tissue membranes, and also different types of connective tissue, such as the adipose tissue, which all help to protect the spinal cord to keep it from becoming damaged. Now, we're going to talk about the spinal cord looking at several landmark features, and also we'll be going into the structure of spinal nerves in general, since it's so closely related to the spinal cord. So first, looking at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. In this animated picture, you can see that the spinal cord extends from the inferior aspect of the skull all the way through the vertebral column. The spinal cord extends from the brainstem all the way through the vertebral column, passing through the vertebral foramen of each vertebra, at least for the first 3 sections of the vertebral column. The spinal cord has to exit the skull using the hole known as the foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is on the inferior of the skull and goes through the occipital bone. And the spinal cord passes through the first 3 segments of the vertebral column, through the cervical, thoracic, and initial lumbar vertebra. Now, it does look like there is a continuation of the spinal cord past the first lumbar vertebra, but we'll talk about this because there are parts of accessory structures that continue on that are not the spinal cord itself. So the first thing that you might not notice because these pictures aren't that close are that there are two thicker areas of the spinal cord. These occur in two regions, the first of which is called the cervical enlargement, and the second is called the lumbar enlargement, where the spinal cord increases in thickness or diameter in the cervical region and the lumbar region. If you think for a second, you might be able to guess why there is a thickening of the spinal cord towards the top end of the spinal cord and towards the bottom end of the spinal cord. This has to do with the fact that we have two structures towards the top and lower halves of our body, which are the extremities. So because we need an additional amount of neurons, we have cervical and lumbar enlargement to be able to control our extremities. Specifically, we're talking about controlling our arms and legs, requires a larger amount of nervous tissue, so there has to be more neurons at the spinal cord in those locations so that we can have more axons going to those tissues in the form of nerves. Now, if you look at number 2 at the lumbar enlargement, while that is the end of the spinal cord, there seems to be a lot of weird stuff going on, even more inferiorly. So we're going to take a close look at the spinal cord at its far end, the most inferior end. So first, hopefully you can see that there is sort of a pointy end to the spinal cord, which is labeled number 1. This is called the conus medullaris, and this should be the very tip end of the spinal cord, which usually occurs between lumbar vertebra number 1 and lumbar vertebra number 2. So between L1 and L2 is where we find the ending of the spinal cord, and the appearance caused somebody to name it the conus medullaris. Beside the conus medullaris, you can see there are a lot of fibrous-looking extensions. One person who decided a name for these extensions, when the person saw these, they decided to name them after a horse's tail. Cauda for tail and echina for horse. So they called this spinal nerve pattern the cauda echina for horse's tail because of all of the spinal nerves coming out of the end of the spinal cord, which caused it to look like a horse's tail. Finally, there is one sort of long extension of connective tissue coming from the conus medullaris. This is called the filum terminale, and it's pia mater that helps to attach the end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. So to repeat, the conus medullaris is the end of the spinal cord. It's stuck and held down by the filum terminale, which is pia mater. And the spinal nerves that come out of the end of the spinal cord made somebody think it was a horse's tail. So they called it the cauda echina. It's the large amount of spinal nerves that come out of the end. Now, there is a clinical connection to knowing about the conus medullaris ending between L1 and L2. And that has to do with the procedure known as a spinal tap in popular language, but more specifically in medicine it's known as a lumbar puncture. The point of a lumbar puncture is to sample the cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space. You can do this for many reasons, but one of which is to obtain cerebrospinal fluid to test for infections. Another reason to do it is to supply drugs to that region, such as anti-inflammatories or anesthetics, such as in the case of childbirth. Now, this has to be done very carefully because if you insert the needle into the wrong vertebra, you might damage the spinal cord, causing paralysis. So you must insert the syringe after L2. So generally it's done between L3 and L4. And so you have to insert it past at least the dura mater to get into the subarachnoid space. So you have to go past the dura mater, past the arachnoid mater to get at that cerebrospinal fluid. But you must also do it past the ending of the spinal cord. So we've talked about the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. We're going to start zooming in and begin to look at the more small level anatomy of the spinal cord. And here we have a dissection diagram through part of the spinal cord. The first thing I'll call your attention to is that there's a deep fold at number 1 and a shallow fold at number 2. The naming of these folds follows the same idea as a deep fold on the brain or a shallow fold. In the case of number 1, we're looking at the anterior of the spinal cord, and it is a deep fold. So we call number 1 the anterior median fissure. Number 2, it's a much thinner type of fold, and it's on the posterior. So we call this the posterior median sulcus. Now, there has been a transverse section taken through the spinal cord, and inside of which you can see light and dark areas. So the light and dark areas correspond to gray matter and white matter, which we talked about before in the brain. So in looking at the inside of the spinal cord, it kind of looks like a butterfly. So the butterfly actually has several different parts which represent different types of neurons. First, on the posterior, we have a bulge on the back of through the spinal cord's gray matter, which we call the dorsal gray horn or posterior gray horn. At number 2, we have lateral gray horns. And number 3, we have ventral gray horns, also known as anterior gray horns. So we have dorsal, lateral, and ventral gray horns. Additionally, connecting the two sides of the spinal cord is a gray matter rectangle called the gray commissure. And not gray matter, but a channel that is in the middle of the spinal cord, we have the central canal of the spinal cord. This carries cerebrospinal fluid down from the brain's ventricles, and the cerebrospinal fluid is then able to circulate through the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord to provide nourishment and a small amount of physical protection. So each of these structures that are part of the gray matter present inside of the spinal cord is made up of a different type of neuron or an unmyelinated axon. In the case of the dorsal gray horn, it's made up of sensory neuron cell bodies. In this case, the dorsal gray horns are made up of somatic and visceral sensory neurons. So we think of the posterior, the back horns, think of them as collecting information into the spinal cord. Then for the sides and the front, we have stuff shooting out commands. The type of neurons that would be shooting out commands would be motor neurons. In the case of the lateral gray horn, we find autonomic motor neurons. And then in the ventral gray horn, we have somatic motor neurons. So in the case of autonomic motor neurons, this would be to smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands. In the case of somatic motor neurons, this would be connections to skeletal muscle. Finally, we have the gray commissure. The gray commissure is made up of unmyelinated axons. These pass between the left and right side of the spinal cord and help to connect the left and right sides, the left and right horns, whether they are the lateral, dorsal, or ventral gray horns. Besides the gray matter, there is also white matter that forms the more superficial layers of the spinal cord, and it surrounds the gray matter. All of the white matter that you see around the butterfly are called funiculi. There are 3 types of funiculi based upon their position. We have behind the posterior funiculus, we have laterally lateral funiculus, and on the anterior of the anterior gray horn is the anterior funiculus. All of these contain white matter tracts, which are myelinated axons that are inside of the nervous system. Based upon their position, they would either have axons that are ascending or descending to go to the brain or to come down from the brain. In the case of the posterior, those are mostly ascending tracts going up to the brain. In the case of the anterior, those are mostly descending tracts coming down from the brain to reach nerves to go to tissues to activate the effectors located in those areas. So the white matter, we call them all funiculi, and there are 3 types: posterior, lateral, and anterior. Each of them individually is called a funiculus, which is why we have a posterior funiculus, a lateral funiculus, and an anterior funiculus. Let's take a look now at the outside of the spinal cord, because to connect to the rest of the tissues, the spinal cord is connected to spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves connect to the spinal cord in what looks like the roots of a tree. We have tiny, tiny connections, which are called rootlets. The ones on the anterior are called anterior rootlets. Anterior rootlets connect to form a single anterior root. Both anterior rootlets, number 1, and 2, the anterior root, contain axons of motor neurons. The motor neuron cell bodies are in the ventral gray horn and the lateral gray horn. And all of those axons have to come together to exit the spinal cord through the beginning of a spinal nerve at number 1, the anterior rootlets, which then combine into the anterior root. So those contain motor signals, both autonomic or somatic. Let's look at the posterior. On the posterior, we have tiny, tiny endings, which are called posterior rootlets. Those combine into a posterior root, and they actually originated at a structure called the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. You can just say dorsal root ganglion is one of the popular phrases. While the anterior had motor neuron axons, the posterior has cell bodies of sensory neurons. These can be both somatic or autonomic sensory neurons, but they are held within the dorsal root ganglion, and then their axons combine into the posterior root, number 2, and then they continue on into the posterior rootlets before they connect to the spinal cord. So both the dorsal root ganglion and the posterior or root and the posterior rootlets all contain sensory signals. And because these are going towards the spinal cord, these contain afferent signals, afferent for arriving to the central nervous system. In the case of the anterior, those signals were leaving the spinal cord, so those would be called efferent, like exiting, efferent signals. Now, if we move laterally, you can see that the rootlets, which connect to roots, and then the posterior, there's the dorsal root ganglia. Both those roots, anterior or dorsal, I should say ventral or dorsal, or anterior or posterior, they all combine into the complete spinal nerve. So all of that stuff combines, and it's one all-purpose nerve which contains both motor and sensory signals together. And it's this combination of motor and sensory signals that has to come out of the vertebral column as spinal nerves. Now, the spinal nerves come out the sides of the vertebral column, and because of the way that the vertebrae stack in the vertebral column, there are side holes that go along the lateral surface of the vertebral column. These holes for spinal nerves are called the intervertebral foramen. So spinal nerves have to come out the side, leaving the spinal cord. Then each spinal nerve breaks off into two ends to either serve the back muscles and skin in the case of the posterior ramus, or to basically everything else on the anterior, like the tissues and organs, skin, that occurs through the anterior ramus. So in the case of both the posterior and anterior ramus, we are talking about the complete spinal nerve that carries both motor and sensory information at the same time. So both the ramuses, I should call them rami, anterior and posterior rami, and then the spinal nerve, they all carry both sensory and motor signals. So I wanted to give you a diagram that shows you the information loop so that you can put together how these parts work together. If some sensation is triggered that has to be due to a sensory receptor, which is part of a sensory neuron, the location of the sensory neuron is always at number 1, which is at the dorsal root ganglion. So inside of that bulge are the sensory neuron cell bodies. They're collecting information and are delivering it to the spinal cord or eventually to the brain. That is why we would say that there are afferent signals traveling through the dorsal root ganglia and the dorsal root and the posterior rootlets. These are signals that are arriving to the central nervous system. At number 2, there are interneurons of the central nervous system. If appropriate, the interneurons could handle a reflex response, which would be just carried out through the spinal cord. Or there can also be interneurons in the brain that need the information. And we would have further sensory neurons that will go up the spinal cord through one of the tracts of the posterior funiculus to carry that information to the brain. In either case, the interneurons are going to take take the information from the sensory neurons and decide on a response. When triggering a response, the neurons responsible for activating an effector would be at number 3 or 4. Number 3 being somatic motor neurons, if it is a response that is controlling skeletal muscle. And number 4, an autonomic motor neuron, if it is controlling smooth muscle, a gland, or some sort of other tissue. Now, in both number 3 and 4, those axons are going to travel through the anterior rootlets and anterior root. So all of that contains efferent signals because those signals are exiting the central nervous system to go to effector tissues. So efferent or exiting signals. Now, in the case of the spinal nerves, there is an additional set of structures besides the anterior and posterior rami. If we're using the autonomic nervous system, also known as the visceral nervous system, to try to activate visceral effectors, such as smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, then we would use these additional structures which come off the spinal nerves. The small extensions are called rami communicants, and these are the axons of autonomic or visceral motor neurons. Now, the autonomic or visceral motor neurons actually have to use a ganglia, and one type of ganglia is located close to the spinal cord. These are called sympathetic chain ganglia, also known as sympathetic trunk ganglia in some books. You may see in your laboratory or on videos a view of the spinal nerves looking from the anterior. And instead of a cross-section, this is more of an anterior lateral view. You can see going up and down beside the vertebral column, and outside of that is the sympathetic chain ganglia. So they're named because they go up and down the outside of the vertebral column in a chain. They're connected, okay, the sympathetic chain ganglia to the anterior ramus through rami communicants, okay, which are the little connections, and those carry autonomic motor signals. We'll come back to talk about how the sympathetic chain ganglia work with the autonomic or visceral nervous system. But what's very important now is that we talk about the spinal nerves. So for your third lecture learning outcome, it's important that you're able to describe the spinal nerves and how they are organized in things called nerve plexuses. The idea of a nerve plexus is that a plexus is a very branched network of things like fibers. Nerve plexuses are basically the pattern of branched spinal nerves. These only occur through the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. The posterior ramus doesn't contain as extensive amounts of fibers, so it's only the anterior rami that occur in nerve plexuses. As you can see in this diagram, the nerve plexuses have names for either the area of the body that they emerge from and control. So we have 4 different nerve plexuses to describe. The 4 in order from most superior to inferior are the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. So let's begin with the cervical plexus. where we will first sort of look closely at the bones to see where these spinal nerves come out. First, the cervical plexus. If you can see the orange, those are where the anterior rami of the spinal nerves first come out. So these come out of the area near the first 4 cervical vertebrae. And in general, these create nerves that are important for serving the muscles of the neck and sensation of the skin. There's also some connections to the shoulder and head portions. So cervical plexus coming out of the first few cervical vertebrae to go into the neck, the shoulder, and some areas of the head, especially for the muscles of the neck. After the cervical plexus, we reach the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is made of nerves that emerge from the inferior cervical to the first thoracic vertebra. You can see the anterior rami at the orange areas. Let's take a closer look. In the case of number 1, those are the anterior rami, and sometimes they're still called anterior roots. So you can see how there are several that come out of the cervical vertebra on the inferior area and also close to the first thoracic vertebra. After anterior roots, we see that the neck structure are combined between some of the anterior roots. We call those trunks. After the trunks, we see that there's also some combining and exchanging where the pattern of the fibers change, and we end up with 3 cords. There are 3 cords, either the lateral cord, the posterior cord, and the medial cord. These 3 cords connect to different nerves that we'll go over. So we go from roots to trunks to cords. So we would think of like a tree that has a kite in it, like flying a kite. So first we have the roots, then the trunk of the tree, and then we have cords, where we have lateral, posterior, and medial cords. Let's begin with the lateral cord and think about the nerves that are connected to that branch of the brachial plexus. So if you look at the upper right image, we can see an arrow pointing at the lateral cord. Coming from the lateral cord is the musculocutaneous nerve. This nerve moves down the anterior of the brachial region and serves anterior arm muscles, especially in the case of the biceps brachii and the brachialis. These will help enable flexion at the elbow joint. Next, we have the posterior cord, which has a branch into the axillary nerve. This goes through the axillary region or armpit and helps connect to things like the deltoid and teres minor muscles. The posterior cord also connects further on to the radial nerve, which passes on the posterior and radial side of the arm and goes to connect to posterior arm muscles in the case of connecting to several extensor muscles. After the posterior cord, we now have the medial cord of the brachial plexus. The medial cord connects to the ulnar nerve, which runs along the medial side of the arm and helps to connect to some of the arm flexors, such as the flexor carpi ulnaris. So from the medial cord to the ulnar nerve, which goes down basically the ulnar side of the arm, which is the medial surface. connecting two flexors. There is a combination between the lateral and medial cord, which both merge to become the median nerve. The median nerve passes through the anterior of the arm into the forearm and helps to serve some of the anterior forearm muscles, especially those that will help enable flexion. Let's look at our third plexus. Third plexus comes out of the area near the lumbar region, and so this is called the lumbar plexus, near the lumbar vertebra. One important nerve is known to come out of through the lumbar plexus, and that one is called the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve helps to activate muscles that are located close to the os coxa and femur, such as the iliacus and the four quadriceps femoris muscles, the rectus femoris and the three vastus muscles, as well as the sartorius. This lumbar plexus has a very important femoral nerve. In addition, the lumbar plexus, besides the femoral nerve, which we just talked about, there's also going on the medial surface of the thigh and lower leg, we have the saphenous nerve, which is a continuation of the femoral nerve and helps to provide some sensory collection of information for the leg and calf. The final section of the nerve plexuses is called the sacral plexus, obviously because those nerves come out of the sacrum. At times, the sacral plexus can be jumbled and shoved into the lumbar plexus, which we call the lumbosacral plexus. For now, I'll keep them separate, but in your lab, you may see that some of the nerves get lumped into the sacral plexus. Now, an important nerve of the sacral plexus is called the sciatic nerve. And I'll circle it for you here on this diagram that I thought showed a good picture of the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is important as it attaches to several other nerves that serve the muscles of your thigh and leg. This includes the tibial nerve going through the posterior thigh, which then also is next to the common fibular nerve. And the common fibular nerve first goes through the lateral knee. And the common fibular nerve itself splits into the superficial fibular nerve, which goes into the lateral leg, or the deep fibular nerve, which goes into the anterior leg. So there's first a split between the tibial nerve and the common fibular nerve. And finally, originating between the tibial and common fibular nerve area is the sural nerve, which serves the leg and foot area. So in the lab, you'll explore these nerves and look at their branching patterns using A and P revealed, and hopefully you'll get some more exposure to these nerves because there are a lot of them. So the last thing I want to do is help to connect back a little bit to the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Some of you may be familiar with this idea that the autonomic or visceral nervous system is important for controlling subconscious or automatic processes in the body, such as monitoring blood pressure or the fullness of your stomach, basically things that would be controlled subconsciously, like breathing, where you don't generally think about doing it because your body has these visceral or autonomic divisions that control these processes. In the autonomic or visceral nervous system, there are two divisions. One type of response is the sympathetic division, and another type of response is the parasympathetic division. We're going to review their general ideas and then think about how the parts of the nervous system slightly differ in how they are used and the type of responses that would be triggered when one or the other division of the autonomic nervous system is activated. So think of sympathetic with the letter S and parasympathetic with the letter P. I like to think of the sympathetic division thinking about what would happen if I opened a door and saw a gigantic angry bear. The sympathetic division is the portion of the autonomic nervous system that's activated in response to stress. This is also called a fight or flight response. Think about what your body would need if it were in a dangerous or stressful situation. In our most primal stages, if we are faced with something like a bear or an attacker or danger, we are going to want to escape and survive from this dangerous situation. So what would you want to do if you wanted to get away from a bear? Well, let's look at the responses on this chart. In order to help you see, your pupils can dilate. In the case of the lungs, your airways will open by relaxing structures called bronchi. Your heart rate would increase, and glucose production would be increased from the liver. Your body would produce stress hormones to help promote and push these responses in the form of adrenaline or epinephrine. And if you are scared and you need to run away, you are not going to be spending time on digesting food. So what happens is your saliva production goes down, and the smooth muscle in your stomach and the glands in the stomach and small intestines will be inhibited because your body doesn't want to spend time digesting because you don't have time to do that. You need to shift blood flow to the lungs and the skeletal muscle and to the liver so that you can run away. Now let's switch this. Sympathetic activation results in stress responses. What about the parasympathetic division? I like to think about it as what happens if you are sitting around and you have a piece of pie. This is a relaxation response, also known as rest and digest. This especially happens after you've eaten a large meal, or when you are relaxing and taking a period where you are not in danger and are in a safe place. This is basically the opposite of the sympathetic response. You now have time to relax and digest your food, and you don't have to run away anywhere if the parasympathetic response is indeed appropriately activated. So, what would happen? Well, you don't need to see as well, so your pupils would constrict, meaning that they would get smaller. Saliva production would go up, and the muscles in your stomach and small intestines would begin activating, and the glands would begin secretion of enzymes and acid. To support that, your liver would also secrete bile to help digestion. Because you're not breathing as fast, the airways in your lungs, known as bronchi, would also constrict to reduce airflow. So in general, the idea is that you're going to slow down the processes that you needed when you were trying to escape, and then switch on digestion processes like glands that help to secrete enzymes and acid, and also the smooth muscle in your digestive tract, like in the stomach. Another thing that differs between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system is sort of the pattern of sensory neurons to motor neurons. This is a complicated diagram that I just thought helped to clarify how the circuits of neurons work. If you look in the bottom right, there's a pink rectangle which represents a piece of skin that has a sensory receptor in it. The sensory receptor is sort of like the dendrite of a sensory neuron, whose cell body is in the posterior root ganglion. If something triggers the sensory receptor in your skin, that would trigger signaling in the sensory neuron in the posterior root ganglion, which would then send an afferent signal to the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, in the spinal cord of the brain, interneurons would interpret that information and potentially would trigger some sort of response. If it's a voluntary response, such as you deciding to itch something, that would occur through the anterior gray horn through a somatic motor neuron. The effector that the somatic motor neuron connects to would be skeletal muscle. Remember, somatic means that you are willfully making it happen, consciously and voluntarily. This is why we are using the anterior gray horn, because it has to be a somatic motor neuron. So we would go from the sensory receptor, located at number 1, and the sensory receptor is part of the somatic sensory neuron, number 2. The neuron's cell body exists in number 3, the posterior root ganglion, which would then reach the spinal cord and brain to find interneurons to integrate this information. And then, if necessary, you would trigger a voluntary response using a somatic motor neuron that connects to skeletal muscle. There's only one motor neuron in the somatic nervous system circuit. If we think about the autonomic nervous system, then we switch. Instead, we see that in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions, they have 2 motor neurons. The 2 motor neurons have names. They're usually called pre- and post-ganglionic motor neurons. The connection of the neurons into the tissues is called innervation. So like in nerve, like a nerve in there. Okay. So there are 2 neurons, a preganglionic autonomic motor neuron whose cell body is in the lateral gray horn. The preganglionic neuron then reaches a second neuron, which is located in the sympathetic chain ganglia. And that second neuron is the postganglionic neuron, which lives in the sympathetic chain ganglia, and then sends an axon to the effector tissue. There's still a loop between a sensory neuron, which goes to the central nervous system and then comes back out. But the 2 takeaways are that in the autonomic nervous system, there's 2 motor neurons, a pre- and post-ganglionic motor neuron, and that the sympathetic division uses the sympathetic chain ganglia as the place where the second neuron is located, the second motor neuron. The parasympathetic innervation is similar, but the location of the ganglia is different. There are 2 motor neurons that occur in a row, so there's a pre- and post-ganglionic neuron, but the location of the ganglia where the second motor neuron's cell body exists is different. In the case of the parasympathetic ganglia, they are located in what are called terminal ganglia, which are very close to or within the effector organ. So for example, the terminal ganglia would be located very close to or inside of the small intestines if you wanted to trigger smooth muscle in the small intestines. So the parasympathetic innervation occurs through terminal ganglia closer to or within the organs. There's still a pre- and postganglionic neuron, but the idea is their ganglia, called terminal ganglia, are located closer to the organ. In the case of the sympathetic division, the ganglia used are in the sympathetic chain ganglia, which are located closer to the spinal cord. So, that was a lot of information. You reviewed the structure of the spinal cord, including its protective structures in the case of connective tissues like bone, the 3 spinal meninges, the epidural fat. You then review the structure of spinal nerves. You also looked at the structure of the spinal cord on the inside with the different horns and the funiculi. Then you went through examples of the spinal nerves, looking at nerve plexuses and individual nerves. And then finally, we went into some detail about the autonomic or visceral nervous system. Okay? The lab is going to help you explore these different ideas. There's going to be a lot of videos of models and also some slides. If you need help, please give me an email, a message, or text message, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Okay? And have a good day. Take care, everybody.